Module 3, Subaltern Critic, the Case of Indian Nationalism. In this module, we will be looking at Ranajit Guha's opinion on the subaltern perspective with specific reference to the nationalist movement and the historiography of colonial India. A key movement in post-colonial studies was the 1980 intervention of the Subaltern Studies group. Within Subaltern Studies, a term first used by Ranajit Guha, the word subaltern stands as a name for the general attribute of subordination in South Asian society, whether this is expressed in terms of class, caste, age, gender and office or in any other way. Subaltern studies analyzes the binary relationship of the subaltern and ruling classes and thus studies the interplay of dominance and subordination in colonial systems, most notably India, though the methods of the movement have since been applied to other nations, spaces and historical movements. Subaltern studies as a whole aims to uncover the histories of groups that within the colonial and nationalist archives went largely shunted to the margins or undocumented altogether. Turning towards popular accounts of public history and memory, in order to combat what Guha terms as elitism, the Subaltern Studies group's primary focus was and is to recover, examine and privilege the agency of the underclass within the networks of capitalism, colonialism and nationalism. Taking cue from the history from below methods of cultural studies, scholars and historians such as E.P. Thompson, Raymond Williams and Eric Hobsbawm had circulated in the 1960s. The Subaltern Studies group aims to focus on working class and particularly peasant historical accounts to post-colonial and post-imperial South Asia, specifically India. This group of scholars emerged out of the University of Sussex under the academic guidance of Professors Ranajit Guha and Eric Stokes and largely involved the following scholars: Shahid Amin, David Arnold, Gautam Badra, Dipesh Chakrabarti, N.K. Chandra, Partha Chatterjee, Arvind N. Das, David Haridman, Gayendra Pandey and Sumit Sarkar. In 1982, these collaborators produced the Subaltern Studies Journal, writing on South Asian history and society in a way that they felt had not been done. This project thus birthed Subaltern Studies as a field. The formulation of the term subaltern used by the group is not taken from the British colonial rank of the subaltern, which referred to military officers who were subordinate. Instead, the term subaltern is taken from Italian Marxist scholar Antonio Gramsci's own use of the word in his prison notebooks, English translations of which appeared in 1966. In its original Gramscian context, subaltern referred solely to peasants who had not been integrated into Marx's conception of the industrial capitalist system. Subaltern Studies then seeks to fill the gap in historiography between the people's history and the perceived history of India, between what has been archived in a narrative of power by the British Raj and what has been regarded as popular history. The scholars of the Subaltern Studies group sought and still seek in the group's subsequent iterations to give the subaltern peasant domain autonomy as the voice that facilitated political action despite imperial dominance. Dipesh Chakrabarti notes that Subaltern Studies emerged out of anti-colonial thought rather than post-colonial, but cites Gayatri Spivak's work and membership with the group as integrating post-colonial studies into the movement. According to Ranajit Guha, Subaltern Studies intervened in historical schools of thought that could not represent the history of nationalism in India without celebrating the role the elites played in bringing the larger nation into the discourse. This existing version of history, Guha argues, discounted subaltern contributions, and so the subaltern studies group sought to rectify the elitist bias in a field dominated by elitism, colonialist elitism and bourgeois nationalist elitism. The writing of the history of Indian nationalism has for a long time been dominated by elitism, colonial and bourgeois nationalist elitism. Ranajit Guha uses the term elite to signify dominant groups, foreign as well as indigenous. The foreign dominant groups indicated the non-Indian, mainly British officials of the colonial state, foreign industrialists, financiers, planters, landlords and missionaries. By dominant indigenous, he refers to feudal magnates, representatives of the Indian industrial and mercantile bourgeois, and the native recruits at the uppermost level. Category of the elite was heterogeneous in its composition, and thanks to the uneven character of regional economic and social developments, differed from area to area. The term people and subaltern classes have been used as synonymous throughout this note of Guha. The social groups and elements included in this category represent the demographic difference between the total Indian population and all of those whom we have described as the elite. Both categories of elitists originated as the ideological product of the British rule in India, but have survived the transfer of power and been assimilated to neo-colonialist and neo-nationalist forms of discourse. Both these varieties of elitism share the prejudice that the making of the Indian nation and the development of the consciousness nationalism which informed this process were exclusively or predominantly elite achievements. In the colonialist and neo-colonialist historiographies, these achievements are credited to British colonial rulers, administrators, policies, institutions and culture. In the nationalist and neo-nationalist writings, to Indian elite personalities, institutions, activities and ideas. The first of these two historiographies defines Indian nationalism primarily as a function of stimulus and response. Based on a narrowly behavioristic approach, this perspective looks at nationalism as the sum of the activities and ideas by which the Indian elite responded to the institutions, opportunities, resources, etc. generated by colonialism. They look at Indian nationalism as a sort of learning process through which the native elite became involved in politics as an attempt to understand and tackle the complex institutions introduced by the colonialists. According to this view, the elite went through this process because of the expectation of rewards in the form of a share in the wealth, power and prestige created by and associated with colonial rule. The general orientation of the other kind of elitist historiography is to represent Indian nationalism as primarily an idealist venture in which the indigenous elite led the people from subjugation to freedom. Here it is the view that Indian nationalism is a phenomenal expression of the goodness of the native elite with the antagonistic aspect of their relation to the colonial regime made the prime focus. According to Guha, the history of Indian nationalism is thus written up as a sort of spiritual biography of the Indian elite. Guha states that elitist historiography helps us to know more about the structure of the colonial state, the operation of the various organs in certain historical circumstances, the nature of the alignment of classes which sustained it, some aspects of the ideology of the elite as the dominant ideology of the period, about the contradictions between the two elites and the complexities of their mutual oppositions and coalitions, about the role of some of the more important British and Indian personalities and elite organizations. The elitist approach, however, fails to acknowledge the contribution made by the people on their own, that is, independently of the elite, to the making and development of this nationalism. We lack records or accounts that go beyond these 2 points of view, negatively as a law and order problem, and positively, if at all, either as a response to the charisma of certain elite leaders. The involvement of the Indian people in vast numbers, sometimes in hundreds of thousands or even millions, in nationalist activities and ideas, is thus represented as a diversion from the supposedly real political process, that is, the grinding away of the wheels of the state apparatus and of elite institutions geared to it, or it is simply credited as an act of ideological appropriation to the influence and initiative of the elite themselves. Guha strongly questions how the elitist perspective, which according to him is a one-sided and blinkered historiography, can help us understand the professional people's movement that was part of the nationalist movement. Guha also points out that even the term politics has been closely linked with the elitist point of view and has been explained to cover activities and ideas of those who were directly involved in operating these institutions, that is, the colonial rulers and the dominant groups in native society. He stresses that what is left out is the politics of the people. He states that parallel to the domain of elite politics, there existed throughout the colonial period another domain of Indian politics, in which the principal actors were not the dominant groups of the indigenous society or the colonial authorities, but the subaltern classes and groups consisting of the mass of the laboring population and the intermediate strata in town and country, that is, the people. This was an autonomous domain, for it neither originated from elite politics nor did it exist depending on the latter. It was distinguished by its relatively greater depth in time as well as in structure. Mobilization in the domain of elite politics was achieved vertically, whereas in that of subaltern politics, this was achieved horizontally. This politics of the people brings out aspects related to mobilization which relied more on the traditional organization of kinship and territoriality or on class associations, depending on the level of the consciousness of the people involved. Guha further states that the distinctive feature of this politics derived from the conditions of exploitation to which the subaltern classes were subjected to varying degrees, as well as from its relation to the productive labor of the majority of its protagonists, that is, workers and peasants, and to the manual and intellectual labor, respectively, of the non-industrial urban poor and the lower sections of the petty bourgeois. The experience of exploitation and labor endowed this politics with many idioms, norms and values which put it in a category apart from elite politics. Guha strongly comments that the coexistence of these two domains or streams, which can be sensed by intuition and proved by demonstration as well, was the index of an important historical truth, that is, the failure of the Indian bourgeois to speak for the nation. There was a great deal of overlap arising precisely from the effort made from time to time by the more advanced elements among the indigenous elite, especially the bourgeois, to integrate them. Such effort, when linked to struggles which had more or less clearly defined and imperialistic objectives and were consistently waged, produced some splendid results, linked on other occasions to movements which either had no firm anti-imperialist objectives at all or had lost them in the course of their development and deviated into legalist, constitutionalist, or some other kind of compromise with the colonial government, they produced some spectacular retreats and nasty reversions in the form of sectarian strife. In either case, the braiding together of the two strands of elite and subaltern politics led invariably to explosive situations, indicating that the masses mobilized by the elite to fight for their own objectives managed to break away from their control and put the characteristic imprint of popular politics on campaigns initiated by the upper classes. The initiatives which originated from the domain of subaltern politics were not on their part powerful enough to develop the nationalist movement into a full-fledged struggle for national liberation. The working class was still not sufficiently mature in the objective conditions of its social being and its consciousness as a class for itself, nor was it firmly allied yet with the peasantry. As a result, it could do nothing to take over and complete the mission which the bourgeois had failed to realize. The outcome of it all was that the numerous peasant uprisings of the period, some of them massive in scope and rich in anti-colonialist consciousness, waited in vain for a leadership to raise them above localism and generalize them into a nationwide anti-imperialist campaign. Guha believes that it is the study of this historic failure of the nation to come to its own, a failure due to the inadequacy of the bourgeois as well as of the working class, to lead it into a decisive victory over colonialism and a bourgeois democratic revolution to either the classic 19th century type under the hegemony of the bourgeois or a more modern type under the hegemony of workers and peasants, that is, a new democracy. It is the study of this failure which constitutes the central problem of the historiography of colonial India. Guha directs debates and discussions to believe that many other historiographical points of view and practices are likely to converge close to where we stand. Our purpose in making our own views known is to promote such a convergence. Critique of Subaltern Studies. Though the original Subaltern Studies group emerged out of historical and cultural studies, the concept of the subaltern has expanded in interpretation from the original configuration to apply to any population that is disenfranchised and unreachable due to hegemonic oppression. Subaltern turns in other fields, specifically literature, anthropology and women, gender and sexuality studies have been made by scholars across the globe. Subaltern studies often overlaps with post-colonial studies, and they both have similar aims and projects. Gayatri Spivak intervened in post-colonial literary studies with her seminal essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And alongside Rosalind O'Hanlon, critiqued the Subaltern Studies Collective for not going far enough in their questions of subalternity. This comes up most markedly in Spivak's book, A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, where in the chapter History, she embarks on an effort to find the Rani or Sirmur in the colonial archive and determines that even women considered elite were rarely traceable in the colonial narrative. Subaltern studies has also been accused of reducing understandings of class to oversimplified dichotomies. David Ludden takes this up in his introduction to reading Subaltern Studies. Even readers who applauded Subaltern Studies found two features troubling. First and foremost, the new substance of subalternity emerged only on the underside of a rigid theoretical barrier between elite and subaltern, which resembles a concrete slab separating upper and lower space in a two-story building. This hard dichotomy alienated subalternity from social histories that include more than two stories or which move among them, and not only histories rendered through the lens of class analysis, because subaltern social mobility disappeared along with class differentiation. Secondly, because subaltern politics was confined theoretically to the lower story, it could not threaten a political structure. This alienated subalternity from political histories of popular movements and alienated subaltern groups from organized transformative politics in the past and in the present. While praising the subaltern studies movement as yielding interesting insights from the dismantling of elitist historiography, Darshan Parasuk has simultaneously critiqued the movement as at best problematic and at worst tediously neo-Anqueterian and remarkably unremarkable in their banality, due to contradictions in the notion of subalternity. After Edward Said's seminal work Orientalism, subaltern studies moved to deconstruct the binary of self bar other prominent in discourses of nationalism, the us versus them mentality, the rhetoric of inclusion that is inevitably twinned with exclusion. Scholars of the collective, including Gyandra Pandey, Partha Chatterjee and Shahid Amin, have responded to this by using the methods of subaltern studies to interrogate the idea of a whole nation or a total narrative of belonging to nationalism itself into more plural representations and defending the fragment. Aside from contemporary critics of the subaltern studies group's 1980s publications, Vivek Chibber's 2014 volume Post-Colonial Theory and the Spectre of Capital is one of the most comprehensive critics of subaltern studies as a theory, taking up not only the issue of binarism as previously discussed, but also subaltern studies' place. Chibber's critique of the baseline of subaltern studies as a theoretical enterprise is that its reliance on binaries fails to deliver on its two basic promises: that it has developed an explanatory framework adequate for understanding the nature of modernity in the East, and that it is a platform for radical critique. Thank you.